ya pada tahun 2014 mengemukakan bahwa tekstur dalam film merupakan hasil dari komposisi berbagai macam unsur pembangun film. Tekstur dalam bahasa kamus bahasa Inggris Oxford berarti permukaan kain ketika dirasakan, merujuk kepada permukaan kain ketika dirasakan, ataupun rasa makanan, ataupun hasil kombinasi dari bagian-bagian musik ketika disatukan. Jadi lebih merujuk kepada kesan yang ditimbulkan. Lalu kualitas bentuk dan permukaan yang berasal dari komposisi objek atau elemen-elemen dalam hal ini untuk di film tentang elemen-elemen unsur-unsur di dalam film. Nanti akan ada apa saja unsur di dalam film. Lalu tekstur di dalam film bukanlah sesuatu yang dapat diraba seperti kain atau kertas atau kayu, bukan. Melainkan dapat dirasakan hasil dari komposisi kombinasi-kombinasinya. Jadi seperti detail halus yang ada di dalam film yang akan menimbulkan kesan tersendiri. Gitu. Lanjut. Nah, unsur pembangun film itu ada dua. Yang pertama adalah naratif. Naratif itu aspek cerita atau tema seperti plot, dialog, dan lain sebagainya. Lalu ada sinematik. Yang pertama ada tulisannya mise en scène, tapi bacanya mise en scène. Lalu ada sinematografi, penataan gambar, dan juga suara. Boleh lanjut? Nah, di sini akan mencontohkan bagaimana sih penerapan tekstur film di salah satu film. Saya di sini memberi contoh film pada masa Orde Baru, yaitu Janur Kuning yang dirilis pada tahun 1979. Boleh lanjut? Nah, di satu adegan ini, secara sinematografi mengambil dua angle. Yang pertama adalah low angle, yang memberikan kesan gagah, berkuasa, dan kuat. Dalam hal ini tokohnya adalah Soeharto dan juga Jenderal Sudirman. Lalu ada high angle yang mana itu pihak yang lemah, maaf itu salah. Lalu tidak berdaya. Yang di sini yaitu perawat dan juga tentara. Lalu ada kamera movement, yaitu ada panning to right, panning ke kanan yang memperlihatkan landscape sekitar, yaitu gerombolan massa, dan juga ada zoom in, fokus terhadap ekspresi aktor yang mana di sini karakter Soeharto yang menjadi subjeknya. Silakan lanjut. Lalu dalam desain produksi ini masuk ke dalam sub mise en scene. Jadi mise en scene itu di dalamnya ada setting and property, makeup and wardrobe, lalu ada pencahayaan. Pokoknya segala hal yang masuk ke dalam frame, yang terlihat di dalam frame atau kamera. Di sini ada latar perkumpulan di lapangan, di garis bawahi lapangannya. Lalu ada kostum, make up, dan properti yang menandakan identitas masing-masing karakter. Singkatnya seperti itu. Silakan lanjut. Lalu ada dialog dan audio. Ada dialog yang awal adalah tentara menyerukan merdeka, merdeka, merdeka. Dan yang kedua Jenderal Sudirman memiliki ada potongan dialognya, yaitu setelah sekian kali pula Belanda mencoba kekuatan kita, persatuan serta iman kita, insya Allah kita dapat tumpas dengan persatuan nasional. Di sini menandakan adanya hubungan antara pemimpin negara dan juga dengan rakyatnya. Silakan lanjut. Nah, hasilnya apa dari komposisi itu? Sebetulnya banyak sekali. Dengan tekstur film itu kita bisa melihat banyak perspektif, bisa ke gender, bisa ke ideologi, dan bisa ke budaya, lain sebagainya. Dan ini ada beberapa hasilnya. Yang pertama, adanya nilai estetis yang diwujudkan dari struktur sosial politik dan kebudayaan atau adanya keteraturan dan ketertataan. Struktur ini diwujudkan melalui adanya peran Jenderal Sudirman, Letkol Soeharto, tentara, dan perawat. Di situ ditunjukkan dari wardrobe yang dipakai, make up, dan juga ada properti, dan juga ada latar, dan juga ada dialog. Lalu yang kedua, adanya kekuasaan dan nasionalisme. Dan yang ketiga, berkesan nasionalis dalam memandang kehidupan pada era tersebut. Karena di film ini adalah film di masa Orde Baru yang mana banyak-banyaknya film-film propaganda atau film pencitraan gitu. Jadi untuk meningkatkan rasa nasionalisme bangsa. Boleh? Silakan, next. Nah, tekstur film dapat menjadi misal bedah untuk melihat film dari berbagai sudut pandang, sosial, politik, budaya, gender, dan lain sebagainya. Pembedahan film dengan tekstur film bertujuan untuk melihat keterkaitan antar unsur pembangun film. Jadi unsur-unsur tersebut tidak tunggal, melainkan saling melengkapi gitu untuk membentuk suatu kesan gitu, dan juga bisa untuk memahami gaya film termasuk kepada background ketika film itu diciptakan, baik itu waktu atau era film tersebut diciptakan. Sudah sih paling begitu kurang lebihnya.
Iya, luar biasa. Boleh tepuk tangan Aldina dan Mayanti. Itu hal yang menarik ya, kalau kita sering kali memaknai tekstur pada sebuah karya seni itu sesuatu yang bahkan bisa diraba, bahkan bisa dilihat secara kasat mata, tetapi bahwa pada sebuah film ini bisa diwujudkan melalui unsur sinematik dan naratifnya.
Yes.
Betul, kurang lebih seperti itu. Terlebih juga tadi ada istilah mise-en-scène yang menjadi sesuatu hal yang segala hal yang berada dalam sebuah film, itu juga menarik dan bisa menjadi sebuah pisau bedah untuk melihat film secara lebih estetis, memaknai film juga dari segala unsurnya, kurang lebih seperti itu. Boleh dilanjutkan langsung saja dengan Muhammad Taufik untuk memaparkan makalah selanjutnya.
Boleh sambil saya berdiri?
Boleh, silakan.
Baik, terima kasih. Selamat pagi teman-teman semuanya. Selamat sejahtera bagi kita semua. Pada pagi ini judul yang saya angkat, optimalisasi fungsi desain pada konten Eiger X Taman Nasional. Berkaitan dengan desain pada hari ini mungkin masih ada yang masih berasumsi bahwa desain adalah suatu produk atau bentuk output yang didesain oleh seorang pelaku kreatif. Mungkin bisa dilanjut aja Pak. Oke, nah ketika berbicara tentang desain mungkin selalu berpatokan kepada bentuk ataupun output berupa gambar ataupun produk apapun. Di sini yang pertama saya bahas mengenai design thinking, bagaimana saya memposisikan atau kalian atau teman-teman semuanya merasakan sebagai seorang desainer. Pada proses design thinking sebetulnya lebih spesifik bisa digunakan sebagai proses perancangan, tapi di balik itu juga design thinking masih berfungsi sebagai analisis terhadap suatu karya. Pada pemaparan kali ini, studi kasus mungkin yang saya bawa yaitu kolaborasinya Eiger dengan Taman Nasional Collection. Oke, masih di design thinking mungkin saya dan teman-teman, mungkin rekan-rekan juga semuanya pernah merasakan bahwa proses mendesain masih berada dalam koridor yang kaku dan baku. Untuk saat ini mungkin karena sudah adaptif mungkin dalam penerapan fungsi desain. Jadi untuk design thinking setiap kreator berusaha untuk menggali potensi-potensi yang berkaitan dengan solusi inovatif. Oke, mungkin lanjut Pak. Nah, seperti apa struktur yang ada dalam design thinking? Yang pertama ini ada empasis. Di bagian empasis ini, kalian atau semuanya ketika akan mulai memproses brief, akan mencari sumber-sumber data yang berkaitan dengan solusi permasalahan dari yang berkaitan dengan target audience. Yang berikutnya Saya kurang baca. Oke. Ada define pada bagian pada bagian define menindaklanjuti dari bagian empathize, yang mana di bagian define ini seorang desainer akan mengidentifikasi dan mendeskripsikan permasalahan apa yang akan ditemui dan solusi seperti apa yang akan dihasilkan. Lalu yang berikutnya ini ada di bagian idea. Nah, di bagian idea ini seorang desainer akan lebih menggali ide lebih banyak lagi, tidak hanya berdasarkan contoh-contoh, berdasarkan referensi yang mudah ditemukan di depan mata, tapi lebih liar lagi dalam bentuk abstrak. Jadi pada proses idea ini seorang desainer akan lebih bebas lebih bebas mengekspresikan konsep seperti apa yang ingin diangkat. Contoh mungkin jika berkaitan dengan INTERNASIONAL ini, ketika berbicara tentang Eiger, mungkin teman-teman juga ketika berbicara konten yang ada di Instagram maupun di YouTube, pasti selalu menemukan video-video mungkin untuk saat ini dikenal dengan video sinematik.
Ya,
seperti itu.
Bisa diefektifkan.
Yang berikutnya prototype. Di bagian prototype ini seorang desainer akan lebih memaksimalkan dari pembentukan konsep menjadi wujud karya yang sketsa dasar. Di prototype juga bagian yang lebih penting karena akan memvisualisasikan dari bentuk ide konsep menjadi wujud visual. Oke, next. Nah, di bagian tes dari semua proses yang dilalui sebelumnya, di sini akan lebih konkret lagi dalam pembentukan karya dan akan disuguhkan atau ditampilkan kepada khalayak. Di sini semua proses kreatif menjadi ditampilkan kepada khalayak dan mendapat feedback mungkin dari audiens sebagai referensi lanjutan. Oke. Selanjutnya Pak. Nah, dari proses design thinking itu mungkin tadi disebutkan harus berpikir abstrak dan konseptual, dari konsep abstrak sampai dengan konseptual. Di sini desainer maupun tidak hanya desainer sebagai seorang desainer grafis, tetapi juga untuk orang-orang teater, mungkin untuk orang-orang tari, proses abstrak ini menjadi proses yang menjadi kebebasan dalam berpikir, dalam menuangkan ide-ide dan diwujudkan dalam bentuk konsep. Dan konsep itu harus tersampaikan melalui citra dan objek visual sesuai dengan penerimaan indera. Oke, lanjut Pak. Nah, di sini ada contoh ketika seorang desainer memiliki ide yang bebas dengan ide yang masih memiliki contoh yang sama. Ketika desainer yang dianggap masih pemula mungkin masih merasakan bahwa dalam proses mendesain harus selalu mengutamakan referensi desain atau referensi visual. Tetapi untuk kebebasan itu sendiri dalam proses mendesain, justru pengalaman-pengalaman itu malah dikolaborasikan dengan pengalaman-pengalaman estetis lainnya, berangkat dari pengalaman langsung dan juga pengalaman dari diskusi mungkin. Oke, lanjut. Nah, di sini kenapa seorang desainer harus merasakan kebebasan dan merasakan kenyamanan ketika dalam proses mendesain? Karena dalam proses mendesain, seorang individu atau manusia harus merasakan sebagai manusia yang bahagia. Karena dari proses kreatif yang melibatkan intuisi dari personal, lalu melibatkan dengan pengalaman-pengalaman yang sudah terbiasa mungkin dalam proses mendesain, ketika output itu diterima dan hadir di khalayak dan diterima oleh audiens, lalu mendapat tanggapan positif, maka seorang desainer akan menjadi seorang individu yang bahagia. Oke, lanjut Pak. Oh, ternyata sudah selesai.
Ya, baik, gue beri tangan untuk Muhammad Taufik. Baik, dari pemaparan yang barusan, jadi bisa saya tangkap bahwasanya bagaimana proses berpikir dari seorang desainer yang diantaranya berbicara mengenai struktur berpikirnya, ada empasis, kemudian tadi define, ada juga mengenai ide dan juga prototype, yang kemudian juga perlu diuji coba, kemudian juga perlu berpikir abstrak secara konseptual sehingga proses kreatifnya tersebut dapat mewujudkan sebuah pola pikir menjadi desainer yang bahagia, kurang lebih seperti itu ya. Baik, selanjutnya lanjutkan dengan Andri Setiawan. Enggak, silakan Andri.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Di sini saya akan membahas mengenai semiotika terhadap citra produk, ada visual kemasan teh botol sosro. Setiap hari tentu kita sudah mengetahui atau sering melihat sebuah kemasan. Mulai dari kita bangun tidur sampai kita tidur lagi. Kemasan itu tentu mempengaruhi keseharian kita, mempengaruhi bagaimana cara kita memilih sebuah produk. Lantas kemasan itu apa sih? Secara garis besar, kemasan merupakan sebuah wadah atau sebuah alat yang melindungi sebuah produk, di mana kemasan tersebut bertujuan untuk melindungi dan memberikan produk dari produsen sampai ke tangan konsumen dengan aman, tidak ada kerusakan sedikit pun. Nah, selanjutnya fungsi dari sebuah kemasan ternyata tidak hanya sampai di situ saja. Pada kemasan visual yang menarik atau visual kemasan yang baik, menjadikan kemasan itu sebagai media komunikasi visual, di mana media komunikasi visual tersebut bertujuan untuk mengangkat citra produk dan memberikan segala informasi yang diharapkan dari sebuah produk. Nah, selanjutnya adalah identitas visual. Identitas visual berperan sebagai proses pembentukan citra produk melalui berbagai macam elemen visual. Adapun elemen-elemen dalam produk tersebut sangat dipengaruhi oleh berbagai macam. Salah satunya adalah ilustrasi, tipografi, ada juga warna ataupun layout, dan elemen-elemen pembentuk lainnya. Nah, identitas ini menjadi bentuk yang dilihat oleh seorang konsumen terhadap sebuah produk, di mana di situ terdapat citra produk. Adapun citra produk adalah sekumpulan elemen yang divisualkan dan mempersepsikan citra dari visual produk tersebut atau visual tersebut, serta untuk memberi gambaran terhadap produk tersebut. Adapun setiap produk dan mempunyai visual, yang mempunyai visual pasti mempunyai tanda. Nah, tanda-tanda tersebut bisa dibaca melalui semiotika. Semiotika adalah ilmu yang mempelajari atau teori yang mempelajari mengenai tanda. Next, selanjutnya adalah produknya, yaitu produk teh botol sosro. Teh botol merupakan teh kemasan siap minum, di mana teh botol berdiri sejak tahun 1969. Teh botol bercita rasa manis atau cenderung manis meskipun ada produk yang less sugar, tapi banyak yang menyukai teh botol yang manis ini. Selanjutnya, teh botol mempunyai bentuk ikonik seperti namanya teh botol sosro, teh botol. Dia mempunyai produk pertama atau kemasan pertama, yaitu teh botol dengan bentuk kaca. Nah, di sini bentuk kaca ini menjadi sebuah ikon dari teh botol tersebut. Selanjutnya, dengan seiringnya perkembangan zaman atau perkembangan teknologi, teh botol juga membuat sebuah produk baru atau kemasan baru, yaitu teh botol dengan tetra pak. Nah, jika kalian teliti atau teman-teman teliti lebih lanjut, dari teh botol tersebut, meskipun produknya sudah berubah menjadi kotak, tapi tetap menunjukkan citra visualnya, citra produknya. Dia ingin menunjukkan bahwa meskipun kemasannya sudah berubah, tapi kita ini, teh botol ini tetap visual atau tetap minuman dalam sebuah kemasan kaca yang dia angkat. Selanjutnya, di sini ada visual mengenai kemasan terbaru teh botol, yaitu kemasan yang bekerja sama dengan konten kreator lokal, ilustrator lokal, yang bermuatan kebudayaan pada tahun 2020. Selanjutnya di sini ada proses berpikir bagaimana cara memetakan sebuah visual tadi yang ada di sebuah botol atau di sebuah produk menjadi citra produk. Di sini saya menggunakan semiotika dari Pierce dengan teknik triadik yang dibagi menjadi 3 bagian. Boleh periksa, Pak? Selanjutnya, analisa semiotika Pierce. Nah, di sini saya melakukan analisa semiotika Pierce dengan segitiga triadik, di mana kita membahas kemasan teh botol sosro. Salah satunya adalah bentuk dari cepot yang biasanya kecil atau secara asli itu bentuk nyatanya tidak sebesar itu. Di sini digambarkan dengan bentuk yang besar. Nah, segitiga triadik ini terdiri dari tiga komponen, yaitu objek, wujud dari suatu tanda yang dipresentasikan, ada representamen, yaitu sesuatu yang mewakili sesuatu yang lain, dan interpretan, tanda yang dapat dimaknai oleh seseorang setelah melalui proses tadi, yang interpretan dan objek tadi. Adapun hasil yang didapat dari hal tersebut atau dari semiotika tersebut adalah ikon cepot pada kemasan botol itu menjadi sebuah objek yang menandakan bahwa itu adalah cepot. Hanya saja representamen adalah bentuk cepot yang membesar dan terlihat gemuk tidak proporsional dengan memegang minuman teh botol tersebut. Seseorang dengan melihat bentuk tersebut bisa menafsirkan, merepresentasikan atau menafsirkan produk tersebut mengandung gula dan dapat membuat bentuk badan menjadi obesitas atau bentuk-bentuk lain. Jadi setiap tanda dalam visual tidak selalu dapat digunakan, atau setiap gaya visual tidak selalu digunakan terhadap visual produk yang tertentu gitu. Hasil yang didapat adalah identitas visual menjadi serangkaian proses penting dalam membangkitkan emosi dan kedekatan dengan konsumen. Menciptakan bentuk inovasi visual yang unik dan mengikuti tren tentu dapat menjadi daya tarik tersendiri di mata konsumen. Namun, tidak semua bentuk visual akan cocok digunakan untuk sebuah produk. Mungkin seperti itu pemaparan materi yang saya bahas. Sekian dan terima kasih.
Ya, boleh tepuk tangan untuk Andri Setiawan, luar biasa. Dari sebuah kemasan minuman saja yang mungkin kita kenal biasanya identik dengan bentuk botol, tapi brandnya adalah botol. Terus ketika beralih atau beradaptasi pada bentuk lain, misalkan adalah bentuk tetra pack, itu agak cukup blunder ya, mungkin bagi beberapa hal, jadi karena identik kemasan dengan fungsinya juga ada di sana, sehingga tadi kalau saya boleh tangkap dari pemaparan tersebut adalah kemasan pada sebuah produk juga berhubungan dengan mass communication atau komunikasi massa. Baik, hadirin selanjutnya yang terakhir adalah dia Rafli Ferial Muhammad untuk dapat memaparkan materinya. Silakan Rafli.
Ya, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi semuanya. Di sini saya akan memaparkan tentang assemblage pada pameran puisi kertas dan refleksi yang senimannya adalah Sunario. Yang saya bahas di sini ialah sebetulnya fokusnya pada teknik assemblage-nya dan kurasi pada pameran ini. Studi kasusnya ialah pada karya pada pameran puisi kertas dan refleksi karya Sonario. Pada pemaparan ini ada beberapa alur yang akan saya paparkan. Yang pertama, saya akan memaparkan dulu tentang assemblage-nya. Apa itu assemblage? Kemudian setelah mengetahui itu, kita masuk ke kekaryaan senimannya, apa hubungannya dengan teknik yang tadi, kemudian masuk ke kekaryanya, karya assemblage yang ada pada pamerannya, kemudian kurasinya, dan terakhir kita akan melihat teks kuratorialnya. Yang pertama, assemblage. Assemblage itu sebuah teknik pada seni rupa. Teknik ini sebetulnya memang mengapa pada awalnya bermula pada kolase, memang dia mirip kolase yang bermula dari kolase, hanya digunakan pada teknik patung sebetulnya pada awalnya. Assemblage ini dimulai pada pertama kali pamerannya ialah pada tahun 1948 di New York, yaitu pameran retrospektif kolase di New York. Kemudian pameran yang berbasis assemblage ini dilanjutkan pada tahun 1961 di tempat yang sama di New York dengan judul pameran The Art of Assemblage. Nah, kemudian apa itu assemblage? Assemblage menurut Margaret Miller, kolase berawal dari kolase, satu cara seniman yang menghadirkan kekaryaan, kenyataan pada karyanya. Itu pada awal kolasenya. Kemudian ketika diterapkan pada teknik patung, jadi kolase-kolase yang pada awalnya mungkin seperti di lukisan-lukisan atau gambar-gambar koran yang digabungkan, kemudian digunakan teknik ini pada patung menjadi mungkin bisa disebut juga material kolase material. Menjadi menurut Heru Hikayat, yaitu rakit-merakit atau perpaduan material yang kontras pada karya yang kemudian dipadukan. Nah, itu assemblage-nya. Kemudian bagaimana penerapan assemblage? Bagaimana kita bisa melihat assemblage itu? Jadi teknik assemblage ini kita dapat melihatnya langsung pada karya yang ditampilkan. Kita bisa langsung maknai bahwa oh ini assemblage, ini menggunakan teknik assemblage karena dari hasilnya itu memang sangat terlihat gitu. Jadi untuk penerapannya sendiri dari assemblage ini ialah kita harus mengetahui watak, bagaimana watak si material itu, watak aslinya. Seperti misalkan batu yang memiliki watak kuat, watak keras, atau air yang sifatnya mengalir dan cair. Ya, boleh. Nah, setelah mengetahui assemblage tadi, kita masuk ke bagaimana kekaryaan Sonario yang berhubungan dengan teknik assemblage tadi. Jadi kekaryaan Sonario berdasarkan paparan Agung Wijatika Jenong terbagi menjadi 3 fase. Yang pertama fase awal pada tahun 69 hingga 73, yaitu Pak Sonario memulai kekaryaannya dengan sebagai pematung. Kemudian dilanjut pada fase desenta pada tahun 73 hingga 83, yaitu mulai merambah kepada lukisan, kepada cetak grafis yang berlandaskan hasanah Hasanah Nusantara. Jadi dia memasukkan beberapa unsur simbol-simbol khas dari berbagai ras di Nusantara. Kemudian yang terakhir yaitu Pasca Desenta pada tahun 84 hingga sekarang. Nah, di Pasca Desenta ini Sunario meluaskan kekaryaannya dari keragaman tema, medium, dan material tadi. Jadi untuk teknik assemblage dalam karya-karya Sunario itu masuk dalam fase desenta, fase pasca desenta. Ya, kita masuk ke karyanya. Kalau tadi kan sudah membicarakan tentang assemblage-nya, tentang kekaryaan Sunarionya. Agar tidak bingung, kita masuk dulu. Ada beberapa contoh karya dalam pameran puisi kertas dan refleksi. Saya mengambil 3 contoh. Yang pertama lukisan dengan cat akrilik yang berjudul Kehilangan Kenyamanan di Kampungku, yang dibuat selesai pada tahun 1995. Pada karya ini berbasis kanvas, pada medium kanvas yang dilukis dengan cat akrilik. Namun teknik assemblage yang dapat kita lihat adalah yang seperti yang di lingkari itu, ada ranting dan ada besi stainless. Nah, ketika kita melihat perbedaan yang sangat signifikan di sini, ketika cat akrilik dan kanvas yang bersifat sangat material seni, kemudian digabungkan dengan material-material seperti ranting dan besi stainless yang secara watak dia sangat berbalikan dengan cat akrilik dan kanvas tersebut. Ya, kemudian masuk ke contoh karya yang kedua. Ada karya reflection pada tahun 99, yaitu di sini kita dapat melihat ada batu yang di atasnya itu ada kubus kristal yang terbuat dari akrilik. Ini 2 hal yang bertolak belakang, kemudian dipadukan dan itu sangat berpadu ketika dilihat. Batu yang bersifat alami, material alami bumi, kemudian bergabung dengan kubus kristal yang terbuat akrilik yang itu dibuat secara manual. Kemudian langsung ke yang selanjutnya, contoh yang terakhir ialah karya meditation pada tahun 2007. Karya ini sebetulnya masuk pada kategori kertas di pameran puisi kertas dan refleksi, pada kategori kertas. Tapi kategori kertas ini dia tetap memunculkan aspek assemblage. Karena dalam karya kertas, medium kertas yang diberikan emboss grafis di situ, sebuah jempol di situ, kemudian dipadukan dengan material bambu di pinggir-pinggirnya. Yang panjang-panjang itu berwarna kuning, itu adalah bambu benar-benar bambu asli, dia ditempelkan seperti kolase. Nah, selanjutnya masuk ke bagian pengkurasiannya. Kurator pada pameran ini adalah Heru Hikayat. Jadi pada kurasi pameran ini terbagi menjadi 2 bagian dan 2 kata kunci. Kata kunci pertama yaitu liris, kata kunci kedua adalah keimbangan. Untuk kata kunci pertama liris untuk proses kreatifnya karya-karya yang ada pameran ini, yaitu mengeluarkan semua emosi si seniman pada karyanya, yang banyak disebutkan bahwa proses kreatif ini adalah proses kreatif pada proses kekayaan sastra. Kemudian ada keimbangan pada kata kunci kedua. Bagian pertama adalah kertas yang tadi, kemudian refleksi ada karya-karya lukisan, patung, instalasi dan sebagainya. Lanjut yang terakhir, ini adalah teks kuratorialnya. Teks kuratorialnya berisi ini pengaruhnya berisi tentang kata kunci yang tadi. Jadi untuk hasilnya temuan yang ada pada presentasi ini yaitu assemblage yang ada pada gagasan yang diangkat oleh Heru Hikayat adalah assemblage yang kenyataan yang pada karyanya memang karya-karya yang ada di dalamnya tidak hanya kertas, tetapi memang kertasnya pun masuk ke dalam refleksi. Ya, sudah.
Sudah, luar biasa. Terima kasih. Yang tadi kita sudah simak membahas mengenai assemblage yang merupakan teknik dalam sebuah pengkaryaan yang dibahasnya khususnya beberapa karya dari Sunario dan juga melalui beberapa fase dengan pencampuran material karya seni. Seperti itu. Mungkin ada satu pertanyaan saja dari audiens. Ya, silakan.
Material yang sering dipakai oleh Sunario ini termasuk material yang konvensional.
Ya, menyampaikan bahwa apakah material ini termasuk material yang konvensional atau yang non konvensional seperti itu. Silakan, mungkin Rafli bisa dijawab singkat saja.
Ini materialnya yang sering dipakai Sunario ini material non konvensional karena masuk ke definisi assemblage tadi adalah bahan-bahan yang memang dimaksudkan pada awalnya itu bukan untuk seni. Jadi kemudian masuk banyak digunakan untuk seni gitu. Jadi masuknya ke non konvensional.
Baik, terima kasih yang telah menyampaikan pendamping teman-teman dan saya simpulkan materi ini merupakan sebuah materi mengenai perkembangan di dunia desain maupun seni rupa dengan berbagai aplikasi pengaplikasian yang juga mengolah kreativitas. Boleh tepuk tangan untuk mereka semua. Baiklah hadirin, boleh berkenan kembali ke tempat karena kita akan lanjutkan pada sesi selanjutnya. Ya. Ladies and gentlemen, and next we have an international seminar session with Professor Ricia and Chansky PhD of University of Puerto Rico at ICAS. She will present the international seminar on title Narrating the Climate Crisis and Common Trauma. And will be the moderator is Mrs. Lestari Manggong, MA. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Lestari Manggong.
Good morning from Bandung, Indonesia, Professor Chansky. Am I audible?
Good morning to you all. I'm so glad to be with you this morning.
We're really glad to be here as well with you, even though it has to be done virtually. So what time is it at your place currently?
It is 10 o'clock at night, 10:30 at night.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. Good evening then, Professor Chansky.
Thank you. And when we come to the discussion portion of tonight / this morning, you'll forgive me as it gets a little bit later.
Okay, no problem, no problem at all. Can the audience hear Professor Chansky's voice clearly? Okay, all right. Okay, let me first of all thank everyone who is present here. And I would also like to thank the the director of ISB Bandung Postgraduate Program, Dr. Yanti Hertiawati, SPDM who is here, who is currently present, and also the students of postgraduate program at ISB Bandung. So Professor Chansky, allow me to first of all introduce yourself briefly. So we have here Professor Ricia and Chansky, PhD of the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez. And she will be talking about making disaster visible, narrating the climate crisis and communal trauma. So Professor Chansky is a professor in the English department at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez and the director of the Oral History Lab at UPRM. She is also the Senior Climate Justice Fellow at the Humanities Action Lab, an Assembling Voices Fellow at the Insight Center at Columbia University. Wow. A Research Fellow at the CERLAC at York University, and Fulbright Specialist in American Studies. Okay, that's quite a lot. Okay. For her work on storytelling and climate justice, she has won awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Modern Language Association, Voices of Witness, and the Oral History Association. And her recent books are The Divided States, Unraveling National Identity in the 21st Century, Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, and Maxi Survives the Hurricane. Right, so that's the short bio of Professor Chansky. So we get the picture on what Professor Chansky is specialized in. And today we are going to have a listen to her talk, and I will be acting as a moderator and also an interpreter if necessary. So if there's any comments or questions in Indonesian from the audience, whether on-site or online audiences, I will try and interpret the questions or the comments in English. All right, Professor Chansky, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. If at any time you can't hear me, just let someone know to share with me, to share that information with me. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. And thank you again to my hosts. I'm quite excited to be part of this symposium, and I'm very glad to be invited. Thank you to everyone for being here and for hosting me. My talk today is entitled Making Disaster Visible, Narrating the Climate Crisis. As a means of situating autobiographical projects as monumentalizing and memorializing the communal trauma of shared climatological disasters, sites that are powerful and purposeful in their ability to engage with both internal and external audiences, I will root this discussion in my own mass listening public humanities project, Mi Maria, Puerto Rico After the Hurricane, which has grown since 2017, first into the Sheltered in Place project, which collects narratives at the intersections of the long aftermath of the 2017 hurricanes Irma and Maria, the political protests of July 2019, the ongoing swarm of over 9,000 earthquakes that began in December 2019, the global pandemic of COVID-19, and Hurricane Fiona, which recently made landfall in Puerto Rico, And now into the new Oral History Lab at UPRM, an Oral History Action Lab funded by the US National Endowment for the Humanities. While there are many aspects of this project that I could focus on in today's talk, within the context of the ICAS Fest on Navigating Identity and Creativity in Artwork Symposium, I have chosen to emphasize the facets that might prove most relevant to this meeting. How life narrative functions as memorial and monument. How the visibility of life narrative engages people in the climate crisis, the pedagogical possibilities of mass listening in the aftermath of disaster, and some of the global benefits of mass listening projects within the context of the climate emergency. In this way, I hope to share an overview of my project in terms of how and why we began this project in the aftermath of disaster, how it has grown into a center for recording responses to the climate emergency, and what kind of a future might be possible for us and other communities on the front line of the climate emergency. In this presentation, I use the definition of the mass listening project that I have previously articulated elsewhere. Those that collect several life narratives related to a single issue or event for the purpose of curating multi-voiced assemblages in any modality or genre for public dissemination. Narrative transactions that have site-specific points for multiple speakers to conduct exchanges with multiple listeners. I also use as a starting point for this discussion the 2021 report from the Andrew W. Mellon funded Monuments Project, which clarifies that monuments and memorials, the statues, plaques, markers, and place names that commemorate people and events are how a country tells and teaches its story. The Mellon Foundation report defines a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And their project interrogates, among other issues, who are we instructed to honor and uplift? And who do we not see in these potent symbols? I use the term monument in its traditional sense of celebrating a person or event, but in this case see significant overlap with a memorial that presents a remembrance of someone or a group of people who have passed away. These terms intersect productively in many cases, but especially in that of Hurricane Maria in the Puerto Rican archipelago. When I speak about monument or memorial in this presentation, then, each term is meant to evoke the other. The stories that I share in this presentation emerge from the Mi Maria project and the recent book, Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. And they are all recounted with the permission of the narrators. I do want to be clear, though, that these narratives relate to disaster, survival, and trauma. If it's not the right time for you to listen to these stories, I completely understand and won't mind if anyone needs to step away for a moment. And I also excuse myself in advance if I have an emotional response to any of these stories. As I begin discussing how and for what purposes I am using autobiographical narratives to memorialize the stratified disasters of the Puerto Rican archipelago, I'd like to first give a brief overview of some of the colonial contexts that frame the contemporary crises and map out how systems of power and disempowerment frame the contemporary climate emergency and the stories told in and about Puerto Rico. It is important to recognize that the majority of frontline communities, or those communities that are currently being most impacted by the worst and most immediate effects of climate change, are comprised of people of color and indigenous peoples, and those who have access to less socioeconomic resources. These communities have been generationally marginalized and moved outside the places and spaces of public visibility. And that includes both geographic locations and access to the discourse communities that occupy the forefront of the public imaginary. The image that opens, the image that opens this part of the talk is an aerial photograph of a statue named The Birth of the New World which is located in the northern coastal town of Arecibo, Puerto Rico. The monument depicts Christopher Columbus standing at the helm of a ship with the sails of the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria unfurled behind him. This image shows the statue in its entirety situated on the land, and then there is an insert showing a close-up of the figure of Columbus. The statue was presented to the United States by its maker, Russian artist Zurab Terzelli, in 1992 in celebration of the 500-year anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean archipelago. But no city in the continental United States would accept this gift. Under the argument that Puerto Rico is the only place in the United States where Columbus actually set foot, the archipelago's government finally agreed to find a home for the statue in 2012. The gift, however, was not entirely free, and the government of Puerto Rico had to agree to raise a minimum of $12 million for installation costs, a commitment that they made and maintained despite the announcement in 2009 of a fiscal emergency in Puerto Rico and the 2014 declaration that the governmental debt stood at $72 billion, which was followed in 2015 by the proclamation that this debt was unpayable. In 2016, President Obama signed the PROMESA Act into law that, among other things, established an externally appointed fiscal oversight and management board, which has enacted detrimental austerity measures and triggered a humanitarian crisis across the archipelagos. In other words, this monument, the tallest statue in the Western Hemisphere, which has been denounced as a tribute to genocide, colonialism, religious intolerance, racism, gender violence, and white supremacy, took millions of dollars to erect during a fiscal emergency, one that has resulted in a crushing humanitarian crisis across the Puerto Rican archipelago. When we read the journals Columbus wrote about his transatlantic journeys, concerns about what exactly this statue in Arecibo is memorializing come into even greater focus. In the journal of the first voyage of 1492, for example, Columbus shares that he went ashore on October 12. On that day, prior to meeting any of the indigenous inhabitants of the land, Columbus, quote, took possession of their island for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Later that same day, he writes that he was greeted warmly by Taino peoples, who he reflects will be good servants, and easily made Christian. The journal entry for the 12th concludes with Columbus pledging that, quote, I, our Lord, being pleased, will take hence at the time of my departure 6 natives for your highness's pleasure. In just one day, then, Columbus steals the land of the Taino peoples, commits them to servitude and enslavement, charts a path forward towards forced conversion, and pledges to kidnap a group for the pleasure of his monarch sponsors. The infamous letter from King Ferdinand to the Taínos and Arawaks circa 1500 that followed these journeys of exploration and exploitation articulate the Euro-colonizing belief that the king had divine rights over the people and places described in Columbus's letters and journals. The monarch explains that these rights, credited to Pope Alexander VI and the Catholic Church, gave him privilege to do what he will with them. The letter concludes with Ferdinand threatening, should you fail to comply with this decree, we shall use force against you, declaring war upon you from all sides, enslave your persons, sell you, seize your possessions, and harm you as much as we can. With this letter, Ferdinand legalizes within the rule of law penned by the Spanish monarchy and legitimizes within the Catholic Church kidnapping, rape, enslavement, genocide, and theft begun by Columbus and his men. But in the 21st century, Spain is not the contemporary colonizing power of Puerto Rico. When Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States in 1898 at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, the transfer of colonial rule between these two superpowers simply changed the agents of control. For example, soon after the Jones-Shafroth Act of 1917 was signed, which granted a watered-down version of US citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico, they still can't vote for president and they don't have voting representation in Congress. These newly made citizens were eligible for draft and conscription. While the 65th Regiment, the Boricanaires, as they were more commonly known, was founded just 1 year after Puerto Rico became part of the United States, until the Jones-Shafroth Act was signed, it had been populated only by volunteers. After the law was signed, 236,000 Puerto Ricans, newly made US citizens, signed up for selective service, and another 104,550 registered for the draft. Ultimately, almost 18,000 Puerto Ricans served in active combat in World War I, literally human resources extracted from the Caribbean. In this slide, what we're looking at is a memorial to this segregated regiment that was dedicated in 2018 in New Britain, Connecticut, inspired by President Obama's awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor to the Boricanaires in 2014. This particular image, though, is from 2019, and it shows the memorial after it was vandalized with graffiti and the enlarged reproduction of the Congressional Medal pried off of the wall. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see the medal is pried off. And then the insert that I have here in the image is of the actual medal for reference. This painful recap of colonization in the Americas, the Caribbean, and in Puerto Rico, more specifically, reminds us that all contemporary life stories from and about Puerto Rico are set against the generational hardships of the colonial project. In short, Puerto Rico is a twice colonized space and a current colony of the United States. And this realization causes us to question why we're erecting new statues to Christopher Columbus, the person who began the colonization of the Americas on October 12, 1492, when he stole lands, made plans for forced conversion and enslavement, and ended the day with a pledge to God and his earthly master that he would come back another day to kidnap people as gifts for his king. What is the role of this statue in the 21st century, especially in the space of Puerto Rico? And while we're looking at this statue as a means of visualizing the privileging of colonial power over people, we should also recognize the easy access we have to Columbus's journal and Ferdinand's letter through the archives and other sources that position them as monuments that transcribe the nation and memorialize the spaces of the colonizer, while corresponding indigenous sites of that era in the Caribbean are both historically plundered and contemporarily closed due to budget cuts. In this slide, for example, we can see an indigenous ceremonial site, the site of Caguana, which is located in the mountains of Utuado, Puerto Rico. And I also have an insert that shows a close-up of petroglyphs that are carved into the stones in this ceremonial space. This site was built by the Taínos, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, at least 200 years before Columbus's arrival. And over the last few years, it has been closed due to the economic depression in Puerto Rico, a marked contrast in the privileging of the Columbus monument over the indigenous monument. I live just 10 miles south of where, on his second journey in 1493, Columbus set foot on Boriken, the island that would come to be known as Puerto Rico. I also lived an hour west of this giant statue of Columbus that looms over the Atlantic coastline. I pass it every time I drive to and from San Juan, the capital city of Puerto Rico. And every time I pass it, I question just what the government of Puerto Rico intends to memorialize with this statue. Using the framework provided by the Monuments Project, distributed by the Mellon Foundation, I question what aspects of the national story are being taught, told, and retold through this, quote, statement of power and presence in public. Who are we instructed to honor and uplift? And who do we not see in these potent symbols? This sculpture, The Birth of the New World, is just one example, of course, of a public statue representing the roots of colonization that shape our contemporary national narratives and the ways in which governments script national narratives of belonging and not belonging, calling into question whose stories are interwoven into the ideas that comprise the nation and who is allowed to tell their stories in a public space. This question leads me to wonder what a monument might look like that comes from the people and not the government, and what are, or what could be, the purposefulness of such a monument. This image is a GIF of the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's radar image of Hurricane Maria, which made landfall in the Puerto Rican archipelago on September 20, 2017, leaving no part of Puerto Rico unscathed. The hurricane triggered floods and mudslides, washed out roads, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, farms, businesses. It caused the largest blackout in US history and the second largest blackout in the world. It knocked out communications, led to widespread food shortages, drinking water shortages, and gasoline shortages, and was ultimately responsible for thousands of deaths. The US federal government's initial death count in 2017 was 64 lives lost in Hurricane Maria, which the government of Puerto Rico originally agreed to. However, it has finally accepted 2,975 as the official count based on a study completed by the George Washington University. A similar study done by Harvard University, though, places that number at 4,645. The actual death toll is likely significantly higher. What we're looking at here on the screen are images of a public memorialization project organized on Facebook as a protest after the New England Journal of Medicine published these revised death tolls in June 2018. People from all over the Puerto Rican archipelago, tired of being dismissed or ignored, brought the shoes of a loved one who had died as a result of the hurricane to the Capitol building in San Juan. There are over 3,000 pairs of shoes lined up in this autobiographical act, many with notes attached to them. And you can see in this image that there are children's shoes included alongside those of the adults. The woman in the image on the right is holding a sign accusing the federal and local government of genocidio, or organized genocide against the people, an accusation that was often made because of the failed relief efforts in the long aftermath of the hurricane. And this, of course, helps us visualize how monuments created by the people can be constructed and what kinds of power they can convey. When classes at the University of Puerto Rico, where I teach, resumed just over a month after Hurricane Maria made landfall, we returned to campus knowing that it was one of the only places on the west coast of Puerto Rico that had somewhat stable electricity and running water. The university became a haven for our students and our community, but we learned quickly that many students who had restarted their semesters were in precarious positions because of what they had lost in the storm. university administrators encouraged faculty to ask about the post-hurricane material conditions of our students so that we could direct them to whatever relief services were available. And we hurriedly reshaped our classrooms to meet our students' new needs. As someone who works with autobiographical narratives and believes very strongly in their purposefulness, I added a voluntary ungraded hurricane memoir assignment to the official questionnaire, asking students to share in writing anything they wanted about their experiences with the storm. The intent was to give them a way to voice their recollections and lighten their loads while transitioning back into the work of the classroom. Every student filled notebook pages with handwritten accounts of the hurricane and its aftermath. And as I read their words by candlelight, as it would still be months before electricity was restored in our homes, the desire grew to build a project that would amplify stories of the hurricane in the hopes of generating immediate relief and building long-term change. Students wrote about the doors and windows of their family homes bursting open, watching helplessly as wind and rain destroyed their possessions. There were stories about rivers overflowing their banks and storm surges of ocean water pouring through homes with 3, 9, and even 11 feet of flood waters and stinking mud filling homes. Others wrote about seeing the animals on their farms drowned and crops ruined, businesses destroyed, about empty grocery stores and the search for drinking water. They said that their towns looked like post-apocalyptic movie sets after the bomb went off. The words screaming and crying appeared over and over again. Eventually, I came to Alejandra's memoir, in which she described sitting helplessly on her porch as she watched her neighbors bury 2 of their family members in their backyard. The saddest thing, she wrote, was to see our neighbors digging graves in their backyards because relatives had passed away due to the lack of medical attention in Aguadilla, since the only hospital there had to be shut down and the electricity remained off. Her neighbors had been unable to receive their routine medical care and died because of it. Reading these student narratives and witnessing the organized silencing and erasure of the people of Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria made me want to do more to alleviate that burden. This was the moment of commitment to a project that would gather stories of surviving Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, one that would assemble individual voices as part of a polyphonic narrative of disaster with the intent of making real change for us and others who have survived natural and human-made disasters. In August 2018, less than a year after the hurricane made landfall, I formally began the mass listening project Mi Maria, Puerto Rico, after the hurricane. I offered 2 oral history courses in succession. In the first, I trained approximately 100 undergraduate students from all majors and disciplines at the university in the ethical recording, transcription, translation, and editing of oral histories. All of these students are survivors of Hurricane Maria, each with their own story to tell, who went into their home communities to collect unheard stories of the hurricanes and its aftermath, focusing on the people who are most important to them and the stories that matter most to them. Students participating in this project collected stories from people such as Nilda Rodriguez Collazo, who described her adrenaline rising to 1,000,000 when her neighbor burst into her home to warn her of a rising storm surge at his heels. Luis G. Flores Lopez, who watched his father get sicker and sicker as they desperately pray for the dialysis clinic to reopen so that he can receive life-saving treatment. And Miliana Ivelisse Montañez León, whose mother is sent home from the hospital with her condition undiagnosed, only to die in her own bedroom. In her testimonial, Miliana recounts that her mother looked at her with terrified eyes. She was saying, "I can't breathe. Help me. Ayúdame." My dad was on the phone and said, 911 isn't working. The call isn't connecting. Over 2 months after Maria, telecommunications were still poor. My dad went out into the street to try to get a signal. I held my mom and kissed her forehead. Suddenly, she said, "I'm seeing little stars." She took a deep breath, and then she was gone. It was the most chaotic time. A person is dying in front of you, and you can't do something as basic as connect to the emergency number. The Puerto Rico Bureau of Forensic Science declined to do an autopsy on Miliana's mother, citing insufficient staffing and funds to care for the dead. In 2018, a surprise inspection of the Bureau found 259 corpses in cold storage awaiting autopsies, many housed in trailers in the parking lot of the Institute. This image is of the refrigerated morgue trucks parked outside the Institute in 2019, 2 years after the hurricane. Miliana concludes her narrative by stating that my mom was 54 years old when she died. No known pre-existing conditions could have caused her death. According to the hospital, she had only a virus. The death certificate says my mom died of natural causes. We think she may have died from leptospirosis, but since an autopsy wasn't done, we won't ever know. The student who worked on this narrative with faculty members and the editorial team at Voice of Witness is Marcos A. Acosta Leon, Miliana's brother, and it is his mother who is discussed in this narrative. He requested to do this interview as a healing activity for his family, and so that they could collaboratively work together to reconstruct the timeline surrounding their mother's death for personal and public reasons. The family wanted a wider acknowledgement of the failures of medical care and telecommunications after the hurricane that led to multiple deaths, as well as an investigation of the government offices that failed to serve the people in the long aftermath. Miliana, her brother, and their father agreed together to participate in the Mi Maria project as a way for them to enter public discourse about their personal losses, which symbolized to them an experience that many Puerto Ricans had in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. They agreed that sharing Miliana's life story would be the means by which they build a monument to their mother, memorializing her death and the deaths of so many others. Another student in the project, Brian Ramos Romero, wrote that my individual experience in this project was impactful beyond description. It was a difficult process, like opening an old wound and finding that it still ached. But deep down, after each interviewing session, I could see the relief in my narrator's eyes and the healing effect that speaking up about those traumas brought. In the end, we students working as oral historians healed and connected alongside our narrators. The second course in the sequence used oral histories as oral histories that were recorded in the previous semester, such as Miliana's, as primary text for students to begin community-based service listening projects that culminated in a public-facing projects such as exhibition, archiving, events, and other forms of narrative dissemination. Students self-selected small groups in which to work collaboratively, and each group selected their own topic, some based upon majors, areas of interest, and some by browsing the oral histories collected in the previous seminar. While the parameters were quite flexible, each group began by analyzing an oral history narrative and then designing a community-based research project that connected their work to active learning with mutual aid organizations, citizen scientist programs, or other established charitable institutions. An additional 50 students enrolled in this semester of the project, and there were approximately 10 teams, each with their own community partner and mentor who had prior experience in the area of study. One example of the types of group projects completed by students in this course comes from a team focusing on the lack of potable water after the hurricane, all of whom were biology majors. They selected an oral history recounted by Vivian Miranda Rodriguez as one of their primary texts. In the narrative, Vivian describes drinking from a nearby stream when her family could not find any other fresh water after the hurricane, and how her two young sons, Inti, age 10, and Anouk, age 8, were diagnosed with severe dysentery from drinking unclean water with fecal matter in it. In her narrative, she explains that she and her husband, quote, had wanted to keep Inti and Anouk here in Puerto Rico with us, but then the boys, my sister and I, got sick from the water. We had abdominal pain, fever, diarrhea, and headaches. With no running water at our house, we were going to natural springs and filtering the water. But just because it's a natural spring doesn't mean it's crystal clean. Everybody was going to the springs, but a lot of people were getting really sick. Finally, we decided the boys should go to the States. On October 15, we wound up going to San Juan to fly the boys out. I have never seen the airport so packed. It was chaotic, wall-to-wall people with baggage like they were not coming back. This was a mass exodus. The potable water team spent days doing field research with the Blue Water Task Force of Fundación de Surfrider de Rincón to study how Surfrider adapted their seawater testing program to freshwater sources in the mountainous interior of Puerto Rico, oftentimes hiking and backpacking into communities in which access roads had washed out during the hurricane. Here you can see the student team doing field work with Steve Tamar, the director of the Blue Water Task Force. And here you can see the team at the Ultimo Brinco waterfall, putting the system into practice at freshwater sites. This is a site from which multiple families in Puerto Rico retrieve drinking water. And here are the lab results from that day of testing. The glowing parts on these cards reflect fecal coliform bacteria and other extremely harmful elements. This team ultimately created a short film about the process, beginning with excerpts from Vivian's narrative, chronicling their work studying the task force's process, as well as other sites they worked with, and emphasizing the role that citizen scientists can play in the aftermath of disaster. Astrid Zappa de Jesus, a member of the potable water team, wrote that being part of this research has been one of the best things I have done as a student. I can't stop thinking about what if I hadn't enrolled in this course, what I would have missed out on. As I did my research with Fundación Surfrider Rincón, I kept finding out and learning a lot of things. There are a lot of ways to maintain and help the water quality situation. But development has to start with acknowledgement of the situation. We have to raise our voices and get real about this. I am excited about my contribution to the research and about being able to continue to work on it next semester. I think this is a big and important project and that it will have enough potential to reach a bigger audience. Working with life stories in this manner has been an exciting undertaking for our campus because oral history and life narrative are rife with possibility, offering multiple entry points for different communities, departments, and disciplines. On our campus, the project has already created pedagogical opportunities for students to engage in active learning that stems from classroom community partnerships connected to their home communities while fostering bilingual, oral, written, and digital aspects of public humanities projects that have clear and relevant purposes. These projects demonstrate the significance of humanities-based research methodologies that stand to impact their careers, and perhaps most importantly, narrative transactions, such as those connected through oral history and other listening projects, have the ability to resituate those who have been disempowered by tragedy through the act of storytelling in which the narrator is positioned as the agental protagonist, an act more and more relevant in the face of our ever-growing list of natural disasters. One of our narrators from San Juan, Felix Serrano Villegas, stated in his interview, "Since the hurricane, I have been able to see that there is an incredible emotional need. It is up to us as individuals to try to fill this emotional need by listening." Rafael Ramos Diaz shared that he, quote, "never planned on sharing my story, and I'm glad I did. I was hesitant, you see, because many of the things I had to say were difficult, unpleasant, and sometimes outright painful to say. I thought, people don't need to know or hear about this. It's too much. But I was wrong. People do need to hear about this. They need to know what happened here and all the things that we as Puerto Ricans went through because of our local government, because of our federal government and their inadequacies. Inadequacies that cost the well-being and innocent lives of thousands, if not more. We owe it to our own community for most of the good things that happened after Hurricane Maria." And Luis G. Flores Lopez confided that he, quote, "never thought my story would be shared for so many to read. I am one of the many that are continuing to survive the aftermath of Puerto Rico, the aftermath of Maria. I hope my testimony is of help and that it encourage a conversation regarding la gente puertorriqueña, the people of Puerto Rico." Narrative transactions such as those conducted through life stories have the ability to resituate disempowered by tragedy through the act of storytelling. Benefits that are also reaped by students who have been trained to ethically work with trauma-informed approaches to recording life stories as they act as narrative facilitators, amplifying the stories of survivors. Such projects create these pedagogical opportunities for students to engage in active learning, and these projects demonstrate the power of conducting research with members of their home community. This is just a short overview of the approximate 100 oral histories that we recorded in that year. We're up to approximately 500 oral histories now. And a brief introduction to the community-based projects that use some of these oral histories as the foundation for collaborations with mutual aid and citizen scientist groups that provide these active learning opportunities. These examples are offered both as a sampling of the types of stories that we recorded and a means of demonstrating individual and pedagogical aspects of mass listening projects that stand to memorialize disaster as a means of witnessing communal trauma. Stories from our collective narratives may be found in the volume Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, published in the Voice of Witness book series at Haymarket Books, and in a contribution to the bilingual international traveling exhibition, Climates of Inequality, curated by the Humanities Action Lab at Rutgers University. In this slide, I have both an image of our contributions to the exhibition and the cover of the book. The entire collection of recordings is archived and will be openly accessible online. These, I propose, are monuments. These are the monuments that we have built together to memorialize the lives of those lost in Hurricane Maria and celebrate those who carried us through the aftermath when no other help was forthcoming. And it is with the dissemination of autobiographical narratives about the climate emergency that I will conclude my talk this morning. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres refers to the 2021 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC report as a code red for humanity, emphasizing the irrefutable evidence that humans are the cause of the climate emergency. Why then are more people not actively working to mitigate this crisis on a global level? Many climatologists and climate justice groups propose that for most people, conceptualizing entry points into disaster mitigation is too abstract because the climate crisis and environmental degradation are simply too large and too multifaceted to process in an immediate and active way. George Marshall, founder of the Climate Outreach and Information Network, argues that, quote, the climate change challenge before us is not scientific or technical, it's psychological, and that scholarly apparati therefore will not convince people to take climate change seriously. Instead, he advocates we must appeal to readers on a personal and emotional level. Paul Slovic, president of Decision Research, an international risk mitigation organization, suggests that the climate crisis is difficult to personalize because people can't quite picture what it looks like for them on an individual level. In regard to the idea of climate collapse, he states, if it's hard to picture, it's easy to ignore. I maintain that widely disseminated life stories chronicling so-called natural disasters, survival, and long aftermaths have the potential to move a reading witness to action. Life narratives of disaster humanize abstract concepts of climate catastrophe and environmental degradation that tend to rest in a vague future, thereby providing necessary entry points into a seemingly overwhelming situation. Autobiographical narratives can function as living monuments and therefore be positioned as stories needed for urgent change in the critical fight against the contemporary climate crisis. They stand to make an immediate and imperative contribution to mitigating the climate emergency as they personalize climatological catastrophe in ways that can provide understandable entry points into global conversations that can otherwise seem too large or too abstract. Among the collected oral histories and testimonials in the Mi Maria project is that of Carlos Bonilla Rodriguez, a farmer in the town of San Sebastian, who watched from a neighbor's home as Hurricane Maria peeled back the whole roof of his home. He tells us that after the roof was stolen, there was a burst of wind, and the rain grew so terrible that we couldn't see what was happening anymore. When it stopped, we saw that Maria had taken some of the walls too. I watched as the doors of the refrigerator blew open and the food flew out everywhere. Furniture rolled across the lawn. Framed photos were yanked off the wall and hurled around. And when everything was taken by the wind, all blown away, and I knew we had nothing, the only thing to do was cry. I chose Carlos's story to illustrate the ways in which disaster narratives can humanize the climate emergency because of the ways that this brief excerpt is tied to so many points of the often mythologized American dream: home ownership, ability to provide for one's family as shown by the refrigerator and food, prosperity represented by the furniture that Carlos had earlier described in detail with pride as the center of family gatherings, and the many framed photographs that symbolize both the family unit and the preservation of memories accumulated not only over his lifetime, but reaching back several generations. It is apparent by the reaction to his loss, he is powerless to do anything other than grieve, that climate change has undermined his agency to protect the physical and metaphoric signifiers of familial stability and unity, thereby eradicating his access to this widely propagated version of the American dream. Carlos shares with us the moment at which he realizes that the hurricane has taken all of his possessions, leaving him with, as he states, nothing, thereby bringing unwieldy ideations of climate catastrophe into understandable elements of personal loss and anguish. Despite the clear global relevance of widely circulated disaster narratives that fulfill climatologists' cry for personalized entry points into the larger issues of the climate emergency, institutionalized colonial practices and systemic racism can prevent members of vulnerable populations from participating in larger conversations about halting the climate crisis. Preconceived notions of whose stories matter limit involvement from the very people who have firsthand knowledge of disaster and climate change. Life stories memorialize as they work to resituate narrators disempowered by disaster through the act of storytelling, which repositions them as agental protagonists. However, this act also has numerous underexplored communal benefits. Preconceived notions of the people of Puerto Rico, perceptions perpetuated by colonial dynamics, bar their access to larger conversations. In July 2020, multiple news sources reported that directly after Hurricane Maria, President Trump explored the possibility of selling Puerto Rico. According to Elaine Duke, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at that time, the president asked if it was possible for the US to, quote, divest of that asset. Further reports reveal that in 2018, the president also floated the idea of trying to trade Puerto Rico to Denmark in exchange for Greenland, because in his words, Puerto Rico was dirty and poor. This is, of course, after having told Puerto Ricans 2 weeks after the hurricane that they'd thrown the federal budget out of whack, and suggesting that Maria was not a real catastrophe in comparison to Hurricane Katrina. These actions, accompanied by the intergenerational marginalization from colonial practices and systemic racism, begun in 1493 when Columbus first set foot on the island that would become known as Puerto Rico on his second voyage, led to the humanitarian crisis of failed government relief efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and prevent essential eyewitness testimony from frontline communities from contributing to global conversations and efforts to mitigate the climate emergency. Our challenge now is to think through how colonial practices and systemic racism intertwine in the global climate crisis to marginalize people in their spaces and lock them out of public discourse. What can we do on an international level as people who are interested in autobiographical narratives to disseminate widely narratives that connect readers to these issues, the crises that are defining the 21st century? Life narratives memorialize as they work to resituate narrators disempowered by disaster through the act of storytelling, which repositions them as agental protagonists. However, this act also has numerous underexplored communal benefits. Wide dissemination of such stories of survival in the form public humanities as a living monument have innumerable personal, communal, and global benefits in relation to the climate emergency and the members of the frontline communities who are already facing the disasters of the Anthropocene era head on. In this instance, life stories have the potential to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chansky. Yeah, let us give a round of applause first for Professor Chansky and her very insightful presentation. All right. So we have about 50 minutes of Q&A session.
Tes.
Okay, let us first of all check the audio system here because there's an echo from my side. Someone. Okay. Right, so we have about 50 minutes for Q&A session. Before we start the Q&A session, Professor Chansky, allow me first of all to summarize your talk in Indonesian to the audience here. Okay, thank you. Oke, jadi saya akan coba merangkum apa yang sudah dipaparkan oleh Profesor Chansky. Ya, lanjut saja. Kan tadi tentang life narrative atau naratif tentang kehidupan atau pengalaman pribadi para penyintas badai Maria di Puerto Rico tahun 2017. Jadi ketika badai Maria menghantam Puerto Rico pada waktu itu salah satu hal krusial yang dikritik adalah bantuan yang diberikan oleh pemerintah Amerika Serikat. Karena Puerto Rico masih merupakan wilayah dari Amerika Serikat. Jadi ketika badai terjadi dan itu dari pihak pemerintah Amerika sangat lambat dan salah satu cara untuk membuat penderitaan yang dialami oleh penyintas badai ini terdengar adalah dengan membuat life story ini atau cerita yang berdasarkan pengalaman pribadi dari para penyintasnya. Nah, untuk itu Profesor Chansky menyelenggarakan 2 semester yang mengakomodir pembekalan untuk penarasian life story ini. Itu di semester pertama, semester kedua, kemudian baru penulisan. Jadi pertama pembekalan, kemudian yang kedua praktik penulisannya. Dari itu tulisan-tulisan yang dikumpulkan dari mahasiswa yang berkuliah di Universitas Puerto Rico. Jadi ada 100 di semester yang pertama, 100 mahasiswa, di semester yang kedua ada 50, tambahan 50 mahasiswa. Nah, ini adalah suara-suara mahasiswa yang mewakili suara penyintas badai. Tadi contoh-contohnya, contoh narasinya juga sudah diperlihatkan oleh Profesor Chansky, sangat memilukan ya. Harus menyaksikan tetangganya menggali kuburan untuk keluarganya di pekarangan belakang, keluarga yang meninggal akibat dari badai Maria. Dan hal-hal semacam itu untuk dinarasikan kembali tentunya menjadi sangat sulit ya, karena harus memunculkan kembali atau mengingat kembali trauma yang dialami sendiri. Untuk menceritakan kembali trauma itu kan tentu sangat berat ya, sangat sulit. Tetapi para penyintas tersebut berhasil memaksakan diri untuk menceritakan pengalaman-pengalaman pribadinya. Dan tadi di awal Profesor Chansky memperlihatkan sebuah monumen ya, patung Christopher Columbus di awal. Profesor Chansky menghadirkan itu untuk membandingkan konsep monumen sebagai sebagai sebuah struktur yang megah yang merupakan landmark sebuah kota dengan sebuah memorial. Jadi untuk kasus patung Christopher Columbus itu sebagai landmark, tapi untuk life narrative atau storytelling ini kemudian menjadi monumen juga, tapi secara tekstual yang sifatnya memorial atau remembrance, mengingat kembali. Kemudian tadi sangat menarik di awal ketika patung Christopher Columbus-nya dihadirkan, Profesor Chansky tadi menggarisbawahi bahwa sejarah kontemporer Puerto Rico itu didasari oleh sejarah kolonialisme yang dimulai dari mendaratnya Christopher Columbus di Kepulauan Karibia, yaitu di salah satu pulau yang ada di Karibia, yaitu Puerto Rico. Dan itulah yang kemudian dikaitkan dengan tadi ya bala bantuan yang sangat lambat kedatangannya setelah badai Maria, karena masyarakat Puerto Rico ini dimarginalisasi oleh pemerintah Amerika. Jadi tidak dianggap terlalu penting sehingga tadi sempat ada kutipan 911 juga ya, itu tidak bisa dihubungi ya, karena itu harusnya satu-satunya nomor yang bisa paling diandalkan ketika ada situasi darurat, tetapi tidak digubris ya. Kemudian di akhir tadi Profesor Chansky juga menayangkan komentar Presiden Trump setelah badai Maria. Kemudian badai Maria dibandingkan dengan badai yang sebelumnya yang terjadi di Amerika, yaitu badai Katrina yang memang dampaknya sangat besar terutama bagi masyarakat Louisiana. Kemudian Trump mengatakan bahwa badai Maria itu tidak ada apa-apanya dibandingkan dengan badai Katrina yang terjadi di Amerika. Itu jadi Presiden Trump menggarisbawahi bahwa bencana yang terjadi di Puerto Rico ini menghabiskan uang pemerintah Amerika. Nah, itu bukti bahwa Puerto Rico sekali lagi termarginalisasi. Jadi sebagai pihak yang termarginalisasi. Kurang lebih itu tadi ya intisari dari paparannya, sangat panjang lebar tetapi sangat padat dan memang meng-highlight bahwa krisis iklim ya yang juga digarisbawahi oleh Profesor Chansky ini sudah merupakan hal darurat yang harus ditanggulangi. There's one participant on Zoom who's going to ask a question.
But first, let me say thank you so much for that wonderful overview of my talk in Indonesian. Thank you.
You're very much welcome, Professor Chansky. Okay, now can we have one participant from Zoom? He's going to directly ask the question. Okay. Ari Adi Purwawijana, can he unmute himself and ask? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chansky, for such an insightful presentation. I'm just off my chat. It's very inspiring how you have managed to how you explain to us how oral history and life narratives have the capability to create mental monuments for our collective memory. And what's more important is how you have integrated this into the students' learning process, which I believe is very important for the students, and how it may affect them in the process of their education. I have two questions. One is you were mentioning how Trump's Trump responded to Maria. And I was wondering whether there's a possibility that local oral histories contribute to global collective memory, because for a person like myself in Indonesia, our mass and social media was more crowded with narratives about Trump than about Maria. I'm just wondering, and I think we should have known about this more than we should have known about Trump. It's more useful for us to understand about how Maria has affected the people in Puerto Rico than knowing about the things that Trump tweeted. And the second question is, I was intrigued by in passing, you mentioned that a student likened the aftermath of Maria to an apocalyptic movie. And I was wondering whether you think that people's prior access to fiction helps people to make sense of disaster. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for some pretty amazing questions. In terms of the first question, I think that life narrative, and I'm mostly working in oral history right now, though I'm very ensconced in autobiographical acts when we're doing non-literary autobiographical narratives and we're making our presence known, so that genocide monument to me is an autobiographical act. And I'm very inspired by Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize winner in literature, who won the prize for Voices of Chernobyl, and her oral history and biographical/autobiographical works. And one of the things that I think she does in such an amazing way is she says that if we are silenced, we must speak together. And for me, what that means is that if the people of Puerto Rico are not in the national imaginary or in the global imaginary, and a problematic person is filling that space with tweets, if we are able to speak together about an event, we uplift each other and we uplift the voices of the people. And so for me, what I'm doing in Puerto Rico is a way to say, if we speak together and I have a way to help people assemble voices into a single narrative that is told from multiple perspectives, there's strength in that. But let's say that somebody at your uni wants to do a climate justice project, and it's not going to be the same as my project in Puerto Rico, but we're going to be under an umbrella, for lack of a better word, and we somehow are able to develop a translocal relationship where your class or your community talks about the issues that are facing you, and then my community does the same, but we come together. I think that's even louder and even more powerful. But I think that we're all familiar with the fact that because our voices are so important and because what we have to say is so important, and when we come together, those voices are so incredibly important, a lot of people don't want that, right? So a lot of folks are saying, I don't want people to speak up about the climate crisis. So I think that that's why it's such an interesting and exciting idea to sort of speak back, or to unmake silences, or unmake the practice of silencing people through a project like this. And I love I love that you picked up on my post-apocalyptic comment from the students and the narrators that they did. Clearly, the next time I visit with the whole group, we have to watch some good movies together. And I think that you're really on to something there. When we think about critical disaster studies, or we think about studies of the Anthropocene, we're seeing that fiction is really embracing these post-apocalyptic narratives. And unfortunately, they're not set way in the future. They're set a year in the future or 2 years in the future. And I've been hearing a lot of folks talk about as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder, pre-traumatic stress disorder. And it's the idea that young people are so aware of the global climate crisis that there's anticipatory stress or anxiety in relation to that. And so I think that post-apocalyptic and dystopic fiction is creating a space for people to work through intangible ideas, because it's a future, but even though it's a future that's not all that far away, it's still something that is not yet here. And Leonor Arfuk, the Argentinian autobiography studies scholar, did this really cool article on there's a generation called the mothers of the plaza, and it's the parents of people who were disappeared in the Civil War. And so those the children of the people who were disappeared during the Civil War have started to create a magical realist / horror fiction as a place to work through the unknowing of what happened to their parents. And I think that that's really, really interesting. And if you look at contemporary African-American horror films, I think that a lot of what's going on, the Jordan Peele films, for example, is people trying to work through the historic trauma of slavery, but being unable to connect with records and things like that. And so I think absolutely fiction is becoming a space in which people work through their fears of very real issues. And just let me finish this question by saying that there was a very interesting group of national park rangers who were doing some sort of covert stuff against the Trump administration. And a lot of people were saying, we read all of these post-apocalyptic novels, but we never expected that it would be the park rangers doing the things that we read about. So I do think that there's something very real there. Thank you for those two questions.
Thank you, Professor Chansky. I hope that answered the question, Ari.
It did very much, and
Okay.
more.
All right. Okay, thank you then. Okay, I will give the opportunity to, there's another one on Zoom. Lutfi Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Ricia. It's really nice to listening to your very inspiring and insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I missed the first part of your presentation, so I have some, kind of clarification question too. So I have two questions, and the first one concerned with the implication of your public history project. So I'm curious, how did the public participate in this in your project? Whether there were, like, did you do this project also as a kind of digital activism, and how did it generate participation in public? That's my first question. The second question concerned with pedagogy and collaboration. So the humanities scholar tend to work individualistically, right? But in your project, I think you demonstrated how this project, in oral history project, open an avenue for a very meaningful collaboration that make history research also a part of a healing process, I guess, right? But also, I think a really effective way to train students to think about history and to do history research, right? But how did you come up with this idea? I'm in the middle of my like a postdoc year right now, so I will be teaching, and I'm very much I will adopt your your method in teaching. So thank you for sharing that.
Okay, we're all definitely going to have to get together and watch movies later, because you all have such very interesting questions. I'm grateful for them. Thank you very much. We have I'm gonna start with your second question, because I think answering your second question gets a little bit to your first question. So I'm gonna be backwards. for me, this project started because 5 weeks after a massive hurricane that really destroyed the archipelago, we were back on campus. And it felt very awkward and very wrong to say, hey, you don't have a home anymore and you don't know how you're going to eat and you can't find your grandma. Let's go back to the syllabus. And one of the other things that has always stood out for me is that we didn't have any running water, and because it was so long until the running water came back, we all had to stand in the water lines. And there was a student who stood in line with me to get clean drinking water for 6 hours. How am I going to go back to the classroom and be like, oh, hello, I don't know you because I am the professor? And so it just felt very false and very wrong to go back to the way that things had always been. And so when I started the project for the students. I am not a person who can put a roof back on a house. I'm not a person who can fix the electric grid. I'm a teacher, and I'm a teacher who specializes in the way that people tell stories of their lives. And so I just thought that maybe, because surviving is a really all-encompassing business. And so I just thought that maybe the students hadn't had the opportunity to say, Professor, this is what happened to me. And so that was how the project started for me. And when I give talks, sometimes somebody will raise their hand and they'll be like, how do you get students to care about your project? And that question is always really surprising for me, because it's like, have you talked to them? Have you paid attention to them? Have you listened to them? And so I think that for each of us, there is something that faces us and something that faces our students. And if we're able to connect what we do in the classroom with that, we're helping them, we're engaging them to the work, and we're creating something. And I think that for me, that's what education is about. And you know, we're not trained psychologists or anything like that, and we can never be trained psychologists, but the teachers are the ones who always show up. And so if somebody doesn't have food at home, if somebody can't find their grandma, we're the sort of adult role models who are there. And what can we do? And so this kind of leads into your first question, which I'm answering second, in the sense of our students at our university are our community. They're connected to their family members. They travel home every weekend to be with their family members. And so when I designed the project, I was very careful to say, you choose who you want to talk to. And if it's your grandma, that's fine. If it's your pastor, that's fine. If it's your cousin, your sister, your elementary school teacher, that's fine. But you choose the person who you think is important, and you think about the story that is important to you. And so we would call that an umbrella model, and we would call it a decolonial pedagogical practice, that I'm the professor, I'm the lead researcher, so I make the umbrella, but once you're standing under the umbrella, you can do whatever you want under that umbrella. And so we've had a very wide range of community responses, in the sense of the students are invested, the people they're interviewing are invested, and so their communities become invested as well. So for example, I got a call on 3 Kings Day, which is January 6th, and the call was from one of the narrators in the book, and he was showing the book to all of his family members, and he was saying, you know, look at my story. And so that, you know, that's like one way to think about that. And then just to think quickly about the digital space, a lot of my grants are for digital humanities. So a lot of the things that I'm doing are thinking about 2 things. How do we remake archives so that archives aren't only in institutions, but they're in the community? And then how do we represent information that we can find in these eyewitness testimonies so that they can be accessible by the most number of people. And I mean that in terms of somebody who doesn't have internet in their home, but I also mean that in terms of somebody who's in the government and making policy, or a scientist, an engineer, a farmer, a psychologist who needs that information. So that's a lot of what we think about. But we think about that through the integration of high tech, low tech, and no tech strategies, because we work with a lot of elders, and a lot of elders don't have computers. They're not surfing the net. And it's really important to us that we never take anything away. So when we listen to a story, we don't want to take the story and run away with it. We want to say, how do you have access to your story? How do we share it in a way that you're happy with it? And so those are some of the things that we're kind of wrestling with at the moment in terms of the digital story.
Right. Thank you, Professor Chansky. Just some comments on your response. On pedagogical level, I think, yes, I completely agree that the survivors of the hurricane need to tell the stories, to share the trauma, to go past it, and then to be able to move on, because it's also very therapeutic for the survivors to tell the story. So I completely agree with that. And in terms of digital activism, the fact that the experiences are written in a book, like printed book, is, I think, better than putting it out there digitally, because we can't really rely on anything digital, because it, you know, it can just one day it's no longer accessible. So yeah, I think the idea of making this into a book, like printed book, is, I think, is a very good idea. Okay. I'm going to give a chance to the audience here on site to maybe give comments or question. Anyone? Okay, we have one here. Ibu Wita. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chansky. I'd like to express my thanks, actually. Thanks for accepting our invitation to join us in this occasion. So you'd like to share your thoughts. You know, I really feel touched that today I also get inspiration how that you share your talk about life narratives, and it relates also to disaster. It also happens here. Disaster is everywhere. I think it really inspires all of us here how to do research on narratives. I think it is really, I feel really lucky to be here, and I also see from the beginning, actually since yesterday, from the session, starting from Lutfi Adam session, I just feel, I question myself, wow, this is a kind of great presentation. And I also see that your presentation also tells stories, it touches our heart. So this is what humanities research presentation. I think it really, you know, I cannot say, I don't want to ask questions, because I think the questions have been expressed by Pak Ari, Lutfi, and who else just now, and also the from Bu Lestari. I think it answers, and also your presentation. Yeah, your presentation just now really tells me a lot about narrative research. Thank you for your being here, Professor Chansky.
All right, thank
you
you
so much.
for your comment.
And I'd like to add my thanks for that very nice statement. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is there something in the chat box? Is it a question or something? Is it there's a question from Dinda Satya on Zoom. Dinda, would you like to ask the question directly by unmuting yourself, or would you like me to read the questions? Okay, I'm going to read the questions, Professor Chansky. So Dinda Satya here has 3 questions. Number 1 is, what do you think about the artwork? That idea is based on disaster, horror, etc. Do you think the artwork is essential to remind people to care for the environment? Okay, and then the second question is about the name of the storm, why it's taken from a woman's name, like Maria, Katrina, etc. And then the third question is, have you ever watched a film that uses music as a disaster illustration? And what do you think about that? And Dinda Satya here, her educational background is in music. She is a music lecturer. So,
okay, what good questions. Thank you very much for this. First of all, I'm very proud to say that we have a project song. So if you go to the Me Maria website, you'll see down in the corner of the homepage that we have a project song. And we're very interested in ethnomusicology. And when I talk about my interest in narrating disaster, I'm really interested in multimodal forms of narrating disaster and different genres of narrating disaster. And so to me, I'm interested in all of the ways that people tell the stories of their experiences as survivors of disaster. And so we have a musician in San Juan who was in the middle of recording an album when Hurricane Maria made landfall, and had quite an interesting time recording that album. And he wrote a new song about Hurricane Maria, and it was not able to be included in that album because of money, time, etc., etc. And when he told me about that in the interview, I came up with a little bit of grant money for him to record that song. And that's how we came about having a song for our project. But beyond that, there is a custom in Puerto Rico that's called the parranda. And the parranda emerges from a time when people did not exchange gifts at the holidays, when people would give something that they made as their recognition of the winter holidays. And oftentimes that was a plate of food, but it could also be a song. And so there's this troubadour tradition in Puerto Rico where you just show up at people's houses and you start singing. And these are not songs that are necessarily written down. Some of the most popular ones have been written down, but they're more songs that are sort of made up along the way. And so we recorded quite a few of them after Hurricane Maria that were about the hurricane. And since then, we've of course had earthquakes, we've had the global pandemic of COVID. And so additional songs have been recorded. And I think that that's quite fascinating. Let me recommend to you, please, Rosemary Allen. Rosemary Allen is a scholar who has worked with some of the ancestors of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean and recorded the songs that they learned from their ancestors. And so there's quite a bit of work that Rosemary Allen has done on songs as life narrative. So yay, super excited about that. I think all forms of artwork and all forms of self-expression are extremely important. One of the things that I was really interested in is that a lot of people did what they're calling sketches after the hurricane. And I think Helen Buss, B-U-S-S, is a scholar who has done some work on, she calls them, I think the word she uses is vignettes. And she says that after people have experienced extreme trauma, they don't have the, I'm going to use the word mental capability, but what I mean by that is that trauma has impacted their memory, their ability to process, their ability to develop linear thoughts. And so her argument is that disaster survivors or trauma survivors can't make a whole narrative. Instead, they tell their stories in vignettes. And so what we saw after Hurricane Maria is we saw multiple people making visual art sketches. And I think that some of them are absolutely gorgeous. And to me, they're not a sketch, but they're called sketches. For example, there's a photographer in Bayamon who made the annual calendar for a bank every year. And the bank called him and said, hey, what photographs do you have this year? And everything was deforested, everything was ruined. And so he just made sketches about what he was seeing, and that was the calendar. There's a comic artist in San Juan who did sketches. So I think that art is incredibly important, but I think that with all narrative, closer to the event, you get less finished products, and those are incredibly important. Further away from the narrative, from the event, you have different narratives where you've been able to process more, and both are very, very valuable and very interesting because of the stories that they tell about different times in the process of recovery. Why are the hurricanes named for women? Well, up until a few years ago, the United States named all tropical storms and hurricanes after women because women are wreaking destruction. What? And so a couple of years ago, people got together and they said, hi, we think that's a problem. So now there are some storms that are named for men, and it alternates. But I'm very disturbed, interested that, as you say, all of the really awful storms in the last few years have been named after women. So I have to think about that a little bit. Thank you for those questions.
Okay, thank you for the response, Professor Chansky. There was a Hurricane Ike when my husband and I were in the United States, in Texas, so in the middle of Hurricane Ike, and then there's this sheriff approaching us and said, ma'am, did you know that there's a hurricane coming? And then they told us to just leave and continue our journey. Okay, okay, there's something in the chat room again. Oh, it's from Dinda. Oh, thank you. Oh, okay, she's thanking you for your interesting presentation. Okay. Anybody else from the audience here on site? Okay, we have one.
Okay, Miss Lestari Manggong, can I ask in Indonesia?
Yes,
Yes.
of course.
Baik, tadi kita mendengarkan bahwasannya mengungkapkan sebuah trauma itu memang tidak mudah. Justru untuk menghealing kita mengungkapkan sebuah trauma gitu ya Mbak. Kita tahu pada tahun 2004 contohnya di Indonesia itu terjadi bencana tsunami, dan di beberapa tahun kemudian dibuat sebuah museum peringatan tsunami untuk kejadian tersebut, dan di dalamnya terdapat sebuah tempat bernama lorong tsunami yang memang diciptakan untuk mengsimulasi suasana tsunami ketika itu. Bagaimana ketika seseorang masuk ke lorong tersebut, suasana yang sangat dingin, bahkan ambience atau atmosfer yang diciptakan layaknya orang untuk merasakan suasana tsunami. Nah, bahkan pengelola dari museum tersebut juga memberikan regulasi untuk orang-orang yang memiliki trauma tertentu untuk diminta tidak masuk. Inti pertanyaannya adalah bagaimana bangunan memorial sebuah bencana dapat menyembuhkan trauma apabila justru bangunan memorial tersebut didirikan karena sebuah bencana di masa lalu. Seperti itu. Terima kasih, Miss Lestari Manggong.
Okay, thank you. Fadli.
Fadli.
Yeah. So there's a question from Fadli from the audience here on site regarding the telling of trauma, which is very difficult. So Fadli said that in 2004, the tsunami, there was a tsunami in 2004. This is the one in Aceh, right? Okay. And after the tsunami, the Indonesian government built this museum to remind people about this disaster. And in the museum, there's a room for simulating the tsunami to get the visitors the idea of being in the middle of the disaster of a tsunami. So at least just a taste of how it feels like in the middle of a tsunami. And in the museum, there's this regulation for the visitors who have trauma. So there's a warning for those who have specific traumas for them to better not to enter the museum or the simulation room. And Fadli's question is about how this memorial building, like this museum, or in your case, it's the book Mi Maria, how can this memorial heal the trauma? In what ways can it heal the trauma? Because it is built from the trauma itself. Okay.
Okay, I am definitely coming over for tea and biscuits and having a longer conversation with everybody. Thank you for that question. We have to work really hard to understand our multiple audiences. So in our case, our first responsibility is to our narrators and to our survivors. And so everything that we do is within a framework of trauma and trauma studies and protecting our narrators to the best of our abilities. But we also want to, through narrative transactions, we want to build relationships with potential witnesses. And I think somebody earlier said something about the permanency of the book, and the point of memorializing and the point of monumentalizing is to make a very visible, very public statement. And so I think that a museum can be a good way to do that. But I also think that it's problematic. And as I say that out loud, I think that everything we do with the public facing aspect can be problematic. And so it's our responsibility to our narrators who have entrusted us with our stories to make sure that every step of the way they are satisfied and they are happy. And we do that through something that's called post-custodial archiving practices. And what that means is that at the end of the day, I don't own anything. My university doesn't own anything. These aren't my stories. I'm the person who others have trusted with their stories. And so that means that I have to go back to them again and again and again. And I have to say, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? I have to have translations checked. Every time a photo is released, I have to have that checked first. Every time we do an exhibition, I have to have that checked first to make sure that the narrator is always happy with the way that I am representing them. We use multiple approaches to biographical storytelling. One of the things that we do with our long form narratives is called a birth till now narrative. And so we try not to reduce people, or we try not to reduce storytellers to the traumatic experience that they've had. And so anybody who wants the book, I'll happily send you a PDF, email you a PDF of the book. But if you look at the book, you will see that most of the stories begin with when I was a child. And in that way, we're trying not to reduce people to their experience. And that's part of our trauma-informed approach. The other thing, I am ferociously protective. When people ask me for different things on behalf of the narrators, I am very protective of those narrators, and I'm very protective of how people can access them. And I also have, in the United States, it's called disaster pornography. That's the term for when you take a person who is humbled by their experience with disaster, and you use that image to sort of dramatize the person as a victim. And I have put my foot down, and there is no instance in which we will victimize anybody. There, you know, when and I had to learn all of these things the hard way by making all the mistakes that I could possibly make. But when we're talking to the press or a newspaper or interviews and somebody's crying, I shut down the cameras immediately. It is nobody's business to see that. I dislike that. And so I think that when we are eager to share trauma and tragedy, because we know that, one, it can promote healing on an individual level, two, it can promote healing on a community level, three, it can enact change in policy, in ways of responding to disaster. We have to remember that our job here is always to uplift the person who told us the story, and it's our job to protect their dignity. And there are times when a narrator doesn't always understand that. So for example, the person who I mentioned in my talk, who is Rafael Ramos Diaz, is a police officer. And he told us about some failures that happened with the police, and he could have lost his job. And so, you know, we needed to sit down with him and say, we're here to protect you. So what is the way that we can tell your story in the way you want it to, but also make sure that you're not fired for telling what happened? And so those are important things. And then I'll just end with, I'm very, and I haven't seen this, I don't know what it's like. It could be wonderful, but I'm very uncomfortable with the tsunami simulation. And I'll tell you why. The first thing is that no matter the scientific intent, it can be used for entertainment. And it bothers me a little bit that here is something that takes human life, and some people who weren't involved in that disaster could see it as entertainment or enjoyment. And the other thing is that when we do that, I just wrote a piece for the Washington Post on what's called the Hurricane Simulator. And it's a video game that you would go to at an arcade, and you put $10 or $15 in, and you get to stand in a booth and wind blows on you while pictures of hurricanes flash in front of you. And that's very divorced from the reality. That's divorced from people who lose their homes. That's divorced from people who lose their lives. That's divorced from people who lose their crops, their businesses, etc. And so I feel a little uncomfortable with that. But when I come visit and we have many cups of tea and then we watch our horror movies, we'll go to the museum afterwards and we'll check it out together.
All right, thank you, Professor Chansky. Perlu diterjemahkan, Fadli? Ya? Sudah, okay, tidak perlu. So I don't need to translate what you just said to Fadli. So yeah. Yeah, I think we have come to the end of this session because it's already 11 a.m. here and it's very, very late at your place. So thank you, very much, Professor Chansky, for being here among us today. And I'm sure we learned a lot from your presentation and the example that you presented with regards to telling life narratives as autobiographical work and the importance of storytelling in dealing with trauma. Okay, so once again, let us give a round of applause to Professor Chansky.
And I'm very grateful to have been invited and to be able to talk with your group today. Thank you very much.
Okay, likewise, Professor Chansky. I was instructed by the committee that we should have a group photo together on Zoom and on site. Okay.
Ya, baik kepada para peserta seminar untuk berkenan berfoto bersama di area depan bersama dengan Profesor Ricia Chansky, PhD. Kami persilahkan teman-teman semua.
Yeah, so those who are present on site will be coming forward to the stage and so that we can have a group picture.
Ayo teman-teman semua, yuk kita berfoto bersama dengan Profesor Ricia Chansky, PhD, yang baru saja memberikan seminar internasionalnya terkait materi Making Disaster Visible, Narrating the Climate Crisis, Communal Trauma. Mundur lagi. Ya, boleh mundur lagi sedikit. Di depan nggak sih? Oke. Bagus. Ya. Mau Pak, bagaimana informasi bagus selatan boleh laki-laki dan bagian laki-laki yang laki-laki belakang. Oke. Mundur sedikit sini. Ya, teman-teman. Boleh dibantu. Oke. Absen di mana maksudnya belakang sana. Ya tadi bayar. Tinggal berapa lagi? Kalau boleh yang laki-laki bawa lagi bagian. Nah, berarti yang perempuan dua ke sana bisa, laki-laki geser, perempuannya ke sana. Dua orang boleh, yang satu lagi. Yang hijau. Ya, yang semua ya. Masih ada nggak ada aja Bu, saya mau dipoto. Siap ya, 1, 2, 3. Tunggu. Lagi, sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Boleh cerianya. Ceria. Tunjuk belakang, Kak. Tunjuk belakang ya. Iya, sip. Oke. Oke.
Thank you, Professor Chansky, for being with us today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ya, thank you very much, Profesor Ricia Chansky, PhD. Dan terima kasih kepada Ibu Lestari Manggung MA dalam kesempatan seminar internasional berjudul Making Disaster Visible, Narrating the Climate Crisis Communal Trauma yang baru saja diselenggarakan. Dengan ini berakhir seminar internasional pada sesi pertama di hari ini. Selanjutnya seminar internasional pada sesi kedua akan dilanjutkan pada 13.30 waktu Indonesia Barat. Saya ulangi bahwa seminar pada sesi kedua akan dimulai pada pukul 13.30 waktu Indonesia Barat di Gedung Kesenian Sunan Ampel ISB Bandung, dan juga bisa melalui Zoom meeting bersama Simatari PhD yang akan menyampaikan materi seminar internasional berjudul After the Archive Listening as Method, dan menariknya juga akan disertai workshop bersama dengan Simatari PhD. Terima kasih, sampai jumpa pada pukul 13.30 waktu Indonesia Barat pada sesi kedua seminar internasional.